Hello, good afternoon. It's tea time here, so having a nice giant cup of tea. And I'd like to tell you a story today that comes to us from Spain. It's a fairy tale. It comes from this wonderful book that I have. It's called the Easter Book. It's a book that came out of Floris Books from England, and it's a wonderful book, and the story is in this book. And the name of the story is The Princess and Prince Hare. And in this case, hare refers to a type of rabbit with long legs and long ears. So it's not like the hair on your head, it's like the hare, the rabbit. So once upon a time, there was a beautiful town with a palace and a castle in it, and a man came into the town, went through the town with a basket calling out, "Who will buy sorrow? Who will buy grief? Who will buy sorrow? Who will buy grief?" And the townspeople just laughed at him. But when he went by the palace, the princess heard him and went to the window and saw, looking down in the basket, were the most amazing flowers she had ever seen. So she threw a gold coin down to him and sent her maid, and the maid brought back the basket. And indeed, those plants inside had flowers that she had never seen before. So they asked the gardener to plant them in her garden, and he did. And then she went out and wandered through the garden and admiring these incredible flowers. And then, just as she did so, a hare jumped out of the flowers and came right up to her. And it was beautiful white hair. And she took off her hair ribbon and tied it around his little neck. And they played all day and walked. And as sunset came, they walked back to the palace. And suddenly the hare pulled free and disappeared, pulling the ribbon off with him. And they couldn't catch him and they couldn't find him. And the princess was very upset, and she stayed awake all night. The next morning, without having slept, she went out into the garden early, and lo and behold, here came the hare out of the flowers again. And this day she took off her scarf and tied it round his little neck, and they played all day. And as the sun was setting, going back to the palace, he again broke free and pulled the scarf and disappeared, and they searched and they couldn't find him. She was so full of sorrow and grief, she went in and didn't sleep all night. And the third morning, she got up and went out again, and the hare appeared. And this time she took her waist belt, which is also called a girdle. She took her beautiful, strong waist belt, and she tied it around his neck and wandered through the gardens and played with him all day. But in the end, again, as the sun was going down, he pulled hard and ran off with the waist belt and disappeared, and they couldn't find him. Now, the princess hadn't slept for 3 nights, and she became very ill. She had a fever. She felt terrible. She had to stay in bed, and all the doctors in the kingdom were called. And they tried to fix her, and no one could figure out what was wrong with her, and they were afraid she would die. And she just stayed in bed, didn't eat, couldn't think of anything but the white hair. Now, far away, out in the countryside, in a little village, everyone had heard about the princess, and there were 2 old sisters who lived together. And they were old biddies, and the one said, I've got a mind to walk to the capital and tell a story to that princess, and I think I could cheer her up. And her sister said, "You couldn't. That could never happen." But the first one said, "Oh, I'm going to try anyway." So she took a dry crust of bread, a little bit of dried fish, and set off for the capital. And she didn't realize it was a long ways, and she was much older than the times before when she had done this, and she had to stop and rest constantly. And finally, she was resting on a milestone, which is a big boulder on the side of the road that has the number on it that tells how many miles to the city. So she was on that milestone taking a rest when all of a sudden, to her surprise, the ground opened up right in front of her, and out came a little donkey with 2 golden baskets, and leading it were just hands in the air holding the reins. All she could see was the hands, and she watched in astonishment as the ground closed up and the donkey with the hands leading it trotted off toward the town. She decided she would stay there and see what happened, and pretty soon back came the donkey, and the old woman had made up her mind by then. She took up hold of one of the golden baskets on the donkey's back that were now full of different treats and foods and good things. And she went right down into the ground with the donkey into the darkness, and the ground closed over the top of her head, and she went down into like a tunnel and then walked through that, hanging on to the golden basket, and came out into a beautiful meadow. And then there was a huge, gorgeous lake, and it was this most beautiful place, and right by the lake was a huge palace, and the lights in the windows were all lit up, and she went toward that with the donkey and the golden basket, and then she let go and went in the front door. And right in the door there was a big giant dining room, and it was set for a feast. And she was very hungry by then, and so she sat down, and hands appeared in the air and poured soup, hands appeared and poured wine, hands appeared and served dinner and dessert, and she had a delicious feast. Then she kept wandering. In the next few rooms down, there was a beautiful room with a bedroom. The sheets were all in white, and the pillows and the curtains, and it was the most beautiful room. And she laid down in the bed, and hands pulled the covers over her, and hands fluffed her pillow, and hands put a candle by the bed, and she slept so well. In the morning when she woke up, a strange thing happened. A white hare jumped in through the garden window and jumped over to the corner into a pail of water. And out jumped a young man, a very handsome young man who looked in the mirror and combed his hair. And as he combed his hair, he said, "What wicked enchantment has brought such grief and sorrow? When shall I be released?" And then, having said that, he jumped back into the pail of water, turned back into a white hare, and ran out the window. Now the old woman got up and went back into the dining room where breakfast was laid, and she had a delicious breakfast. And then she waited by the front door till she saw the donkey with the golden baskets and the hands leading him, and she took hold of one of the baskets, and she followed the donkey again back up through the meadow and into the tunnel and up out of the ground. And then she let go when she was back by the milestone, and she said to herself, "I shall now go into the city and tell of this strange tale." So she went into the city, and she came to the palace and knocked at the door and said she had a story for the princess. And at first everyone laughed at her, but eventually she persuaded them to let her in, and they were desperate, so they didn't have anything else they could offer, so they let her go into the princess's bedroom. And the princess was lying on the bed looking close to death, and the old woman sat down and began to tell her story. And she said all that had happened to her, but when she got to the words white hare, the princess sat up and said, "Tell me, white hare? You saw a white hare?" And all of a sudden the princess came back to life and wanted to go immediately to see this place where the donkey went down into the earth. And so with her maid and the old woman, they went and walked out to this very same milestone and sat there. Pretty soon, here came the donkey back from the city. And so they each took hold of a golden basket, and down they went into the tunnel, into the meadow, out to the lake, and there was the palace. And this time when they went in, there were hands everywhere, and they were readying something for a great party. Now, they walked through every room in that palace, and there were dozens and dozens of rooms. Finally, they came up to the top of the palace, and there in a little room near the attic, there was on the floor, when they opened the door, it was the last room, and when they opened the door, they saw there was a figure lying on the floor, cold and still, and it was a figure of half of a handsome man and half of a rabbit. Now the princess was overwhelmed when she saw this figure. She did not know what had happened, but she felt such sorrow and grief. She knelt down by the figure and took a flower from her waistband that was one of those beautiful special flowers. She laid it on the chest of the handsome young man, which was the top part of the figure. The minute she laid that flower and knelt down beside him and bowed her head and began to pray, his eyes flew open, and he woke up and turned completely into the handsome young man. And he told the princess and the old woman and her maid that he had been enchanted. Then there was a great celebration. The moment he had turned back into a handsome young man, all the hands became people in total, in full figures of servants and courtiers and soldiers and guards and people that took care of the horses and people that took care of the gardens, and the whole place was full of people again, not just hands. And finally the princess said, "What is the preparation for?" And he said, "The enchantment is over. I shall be married in 3 days." And she was very sad and full of grief to hear that, for she thought herself she might like to marry this prince. She said something to him about it, and he said, "Well, I am destined to marry the one who bound me and who freed me from the enchantment." And she said, "Who is this one?" And he said, "I don't know. But she said, well, I am the one that found the white hair in the garden, and I bound you first with my hair ribbon, and then my scarf, and then my girdle. And he said, oh, and went to the corner where there was a chest, opened it, and there was the ribbon, the scarf, and the girdle. And he said, it's you who bound me. It's you who I am supposed to marry. And so then that is exactly what happened. They married in 3 days, and everything was wonderful. And the old woman stayed for them quite a long time. Finally, she missed her sister and her life, and they sent her home in a golden coach filled with golden presents. And that's the end of our story today. And I hope you enjoyed The Princess and Prince Hare, a wonderful tale.